Hi, I'm Jyoti Shah, and this is my podcast, Have You Thought About? I'm a writer who loves to find out about what passions people are pursuing, especially if they're managing to blend together skills in unusual ways. In each edition, I'm going to chat with someone I find particularly interesting and who's managed to fit things together in their life or profession that you might not think of as an obvious match. Here I'm speaking to social entrepreneur Jayni Gudka. Jayni, for you, storytelling is quite important, but you've been involved with some unusual tourism opportunities. Can you share a little bit more about this and how you include storytelling with everything that you do?
Yeah, so thanks, Ruthie. Tourism is what I do, and storytelling in tourism, more specifically, related to sharing homeless people's stories. So people who've experienced homelessness having an option to share their stories in a sector that traditionally tries to distance itself from it. Just big global events where you have lots of tourists going to a specific area where these events are taking place. People who experience homelessness are usually removed from these places where these events are taking place. And we kind of do the opposite. We instead use the stories that people with experience of homelessness have to show that the realities, the different perspective, a different way of understanding a city and the stories and the hidden quirky things within each city.
You've worked with Unseen Tours and you've also got your own organisation as well. In relation to that, why is it so important to work with groups that perhaps considered more marginalised in society and be able to share their stories? What motivates you to do so?
I think it's just sharing stories that don't generally get shared or heard and providing an opportunity for people who always have the opportunity to have their voices heard, to have an active role in placemaking, in sharing their stories and sharing a different perspective of each city that they live in. We work with survivors of human trafficking, for example, who again have a very difficult role in the tourism and travel industry. They often are trafficked through the travel industry, and yet the travel industry tries to distance itself as much as possible for them because of obviously the challenges with trafficking and not wanting to be associated with that, not wanting to be complicit in that. And yet they don't really understand how trafficking works. So we try to change that to allow people from the travel industry to experience what London could look like for someone who has been trafficked, to hear how they could better support people who've been trafficked through walking tours, which makes it a really accessible way to have these conversations, because walking tours are a format, I guess, we're all quite comfortable with or quite accustomed to. It makes it easier to have these conversations because it's delivered in a format that we all know and have been involved in our own recreation when we're visiting new places ourselves.
One thing that's really important to you, Jayni, is that it's not just about speaking on their behalf. It's about making sure that these varying means of storytelling are actually quite inclusive, that people have agency. It's about them stepping up and being able to develop skills and showcasing their own experiences rather than having someone talk for them. Why is that so important for the way that you operate?
I think people with lived experience are quite used to having stories told on their behalf and don't often get the chance to share their own stories. And I think that's what we're trying to do through the tours that we deliver. No one can really understand what it means to be homeless unless they've experienced it for themselves. And homelessness can affect so many people in so many different ways. You have like hidden homelessness, sofa surfing, living in hostels, as well as rough sleeping, which is what we most commonly know in relation to homelessness. But until you've experienced that, I think it's really hard for you to share what it means and to share what it means to live in a city as someone with that experience. And that's what we're trying to do. If you've experienced rough sleeping in London, for example, you're going to know the streets and the hidden stories within the streets better than anyone else because you've kind of lived on the streets and you've seen the street from a different perspective. And that's what we're also trying to show through the tour. So we're designing in collaboration with people with homelessness experiences.
And for you personally, you're quite a seasoned traveller. Like, it's important for you to explore the world, to understand how different communities around the world operate, how people integrate. What is it that drives you personally to do that? Why not just stick to your own lane?
The world is just so interesting, and I'm really lucky that I've had these opportunities to travel and to explore new places. And I think it's the people in those places that really make it so special. I don't know about you and your travel experiences, but it's not uncommon for people to have the unexpected personal encounters with people being the most popular anecdotes from any trips that they've been on. And I think that's always been the case for me as well. Whether it's sleeping under the stars in Australia, for example, really unexpectedly, and hearing Aboriginal communities kind of share their Indigenous stories, for example, which you wouldn't typically get. I think it's that kind of human to human interaction that's really been special for me whenever I've traveled. And that's what I'm trying to do through the work that I'm doing now as well, so that other people, when they are traveling, can have those interactions with people they may not usually have interactions with, to hear those stories in the places that they visit, and to really have that stronger connection formed to the people in the place. And it's just the best way to travel, I think. Slow travel, meeting as many people along the way, hearing as many stories along the way, and just getting to know the world around you, finding yourself through that process as well.
You're clearly not afraid of a challenge.
Yeah, so sama sama comes from the Indonesian word for belonging or being together, togetherness. And that's what I'm trying to do through the travel industry, through personal connection, through being able to work with disadvantaged individuals who face a lot of marginalization, whether they're people with experience of homelessness, refugees, survivors of human trafficking, modern slavery, Indigenous communities, even people in the LGBTQ communities, and helping them share their own stories and helping them share a new perspective of cities where they live, and to create a new experience of a city together. And through that togetherness, I hope it helps them feel better connected to the place where they live, where they have felt disadvantaged previously, but also helps people in the cities where they live feel better connected to them and understand their communities, understand their stories, to help integrate them better into their communities. But also for travelers and visitors to a new place, it helps them see that city through a new perspective also. So not just looking at Big Ben in Westminster, but instead you're exploring in hidden area of Canning Town where Mahatma Gandhi met Charlie Chaplin, for example, at the most random of places. But unless you get completely off the beaten track, you're likely to miss these stories. And you're also likely to miss his interactions with local people who are not your official tour guide or someone working at some of these tourism hotspots in each city you go to.
And with Sama Sama, it is a new venture. So what lessons have you been learning as somebody who has not got a huge corporation behind them, huge budgets, is basically starting from scratch to a degree? How are you doing that?
It is a challenge. Sama Sama as an organisation was only set up in August 2023, so just under a year ago. Although we've taken a lot of learnings from Unseen Tours and working with people with experience of homelessness, we're really trying to expand our approach and work with other communities around the world. And the biggest learning for us is that each community faces different challenges, and therefore the approach to work with them has to be different. You can't just have a cookie cutter kind of shaped idea that will be easy to integrate into each community that you work with. Also, local partnerships is really important. So building strong connections with local charities, NGOs, other organizations that support disadvantaged communities. More recently, we've started working with an organization that supports the trans community in Brasilia, for example, and the way that they operate is very different to the homelessness organizations you work with in London, and also the kind of the legal parameters, the other regulations that you have in each city that we work with, just the culture and the way that people like to work with each other, and the challenges that each community faces are so different. So that's been really interesting for me to learn from these communities and to kind of adapt our approach to working with each community so that we can better serve them, and also make sure that they are truly heard through all the decision-making processes for setting up these initiatives in each place we work in, and also ensuring that they're not further discriminated or disadvantaged through our approach. The trans community in Brazil, for example, face so many challenges that the general homeless community in London do not. So it's a big learning opportunity to make sure that we are supporting them throughout the whole process and putting in extra safeguarding measures to make sure they're not harmed in any way through the process. And that's been a really interesting process for us.
Fantastic. And staying with you, you're not clearly afraid to take risks. And so it'd be really interesting to find out why. Why are you ready to jump in and try something different and, you know, potentially even change direction if it's not the right path for you at that moment in time? How do you guide yourself there?
I think I've been really lucky that I've been able to change direction quite a few times. From working in the NGO space, initially working on content transformation projects in Indonesia, for example. And although I learned so much and met some incredible people who are really doing meaningful work, I realized that the NGO space at that level wasn't really for me. There were so many problems with the way that aid is distributed and how funding is distributed, and a lot of times where projects are not able to change their focus when they realize that what they're doing is not making the impact that they wish to make because they're so tied to the grants that are paying for that work to take place. There are also times where outsiders take the roles of people within a city or a community or a country because outsiders seem to have more expertise, even if they're not from the community that are facing the challenges that the projects want to address. And this is something that felt really uncomfortable for me. I've been really lucky to be able to try new things and to really reflect on what felt right to me and what didn't really feel right to me ethically, morally, also financially. Also, working in the NGO space isn't always the most lucrative of careers, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's also a challenge that is taken into consideration, I guess, as you grow in your career and the projects you want to work in. Yeah, having the opportunity to reflect and change track and try new things, innovate in a way that really helps other people share their stories and to make social impact is what I've really enjoyed doing and been fortunate to be able to do. And I'd really encourage anyone else who has opportunity to try doing the same. Because the way things work at the moment have been often done in this way for so many generations. That doesn't mean that's the right way of doing things. And I think we're really lucky to be living in an age where innovation, especially social innovation, is a lot easier to make happen.
But you've taken some pretty unusual directions. I guess, you wanted to study Chinese and international development at uni over quite a long career space that you've been like, right, that's not it, I'm going to go here. By doing that, there must have been times when it doesn't always work out. How have you embraced that and not got stuck? Been like, okay, fine, I'm going to go to the next step. I am going to keep going. I am going to try something else. Or do you have those moments where you're plateauing and being like, what the heck am I doing? And then do you have like a magic formula to get over that?
I think almost every day I'm probably thinking, what am I doing? Am I really going down the right route? Especially coming from a British Indian kind of family, I guess. Like, even the thought of telling my parents that this is what I want to study, Chinese and international development, and kind of bringing them around and kind of convincing them that that was the right thing for me. And then to tell them a few months later that, okay, I made a mistake, I don't want to do this anymore, was a huge thing. Most of my family, for example, are accountants or dentists or bankers, and that's kind of the standard, typical thing to do. So to go against the grain at the age of 18 wasn't easy. And then to admit that I was wrong and wanted to change again wasn't easy either, because it felt like I was failing. But I did get support from people around me. My parents were understanding. And so that did make it a lot easier. I think I was really fortunate in that way. I think being able to really know yourself or to find yourself through the process has really been helpful for me. And part of it's also just knowing what I'm happy to be uncomfortable with and what I'm not happy to be uncomfortable with. And if I knew that something ethically just didn't sit right with me, I knew I wouldn't be able to tolerate it for very long. I'd be very unhappy if I was to stick around in that space. And yet there were other things where I was really happy to be uncomfortable, and that was advocating on other people's behalf. I mean, that's something I felt so passionate about. So that didn't feel uncomfortable for me when it may for other people. So I think just knowing myself better, knowing what I was able to handle and what was just too much for me and was going to mean that I wasn't being true to myself, has really influenced a lot of decisions I've made. And I think I'll continue to do that in the years to come. And maybe I'll move to another field after tourism also. I'm not really sure, but it's an interesting journey nonetheless.
I'm going to stick with the tourism at the moment, and just to sort of expand a bit further, because you have a lot of thoughts and in fact a lot of experience in the discourse around volunteer tourism. What it actually involves. Is it always a good thing, or are there challenges? What's your take on that?
I think volunteerism is a really interesting topic, especially at the moment. I've had so many friends who've gone out on their gap year and going to do like volunteering with orphanages, for example, or going to build a well in sub-Saharan Africa. And there are so many good intentions there, often, not always, but often there's lots of good intention to really wanting to do something meaningful and make a difference. But the reality is that often these add to the problems in the local community where this volunteering takes place. And that's something that I don't think is spoken about enough, especially if we have many untrained volunteers going out and doing this kind of work. We have 18-year-old fresh out of school or college going out into Southeast Asia, into Cambodia, for example, and volunteering at an orphanage without any experience of working with young children, without any safeguarding experience, without any teaching qualifications, without any kind of knowledge and how to interact with young children. And they're there really to try to make a difference, perhaps. Often it's for those Instagram moments, taking photos with young children to show that they're doing something meaningful whilst they're away, but not really making the local impact. That in itself is quite problematic. But added to that is an orphanage tourism industry, which unfortunately at the moment is involved in a lot of child trafficking instances in Cambodia, especially. So you have children taken from their families because people have realized that orphanage tourism is quite a lucrative business opportunity now. And so you're breaking families apart just for these opportunities for Westerners to come and have these Instagram moments, which is obviously not great because you're not allowing that child to have that family and grow up in that safe environment that you wish they would. And instead, you're creating these almost false orphans just to support this practice that's taking place. There's also the psychological trauma of having someone that a child gets attached to. If a child's been kind of interacting with someone for 6 months, maybe that's how long the volunteering period lasts, and then that person leaves and you're not able to understand at such a young age why this person keeps leaving, and then you get reattached to someone else who comes to volunteer, and that constant kind of withdrawal from people that you think are looking after you and care for you. Maybe they do care for you during that time, but you're too young to understand what's actually happening, and that can cause a lot of stress and a lot of additional trauma to children. So that's one example where it just doesn't work well, unfortunately, and it's a really big problem. With things like building wells and schools in sub-Saharan Africa, you have instances where communities have paid a lot of money for this work to happen, and that money can help the community in many circumstances. But the people who come to build these things are not these skilled labourers at all. And so once they've done this shoddy job of building a well or something, basically just knocked down as soon as that group leaves, and that happens again. And instead, it would make more sense, I think, to work either with local craftsmen, tradesmen, labourers to create these things if the community really does need it, or to find some other skilled opportunity for volunteers, maybe if they're medical students, to go and work in rural communities who don't have access to medical care, for example, or teaching nursing staff and doing a knowledge exchange with nursing staff in these communities. I think that's a better way of volunteering with communities in making sure the impact remains sustainable and long-lasting. There are obviously really good volunteer programs that do take place, but I think skilled volunteering and volunteering that doesn't take away from local jobs, but rather supports the development of new jobs and new opportunities for local economic development, really important for any volunteering opportunity.
But how do you have these conversations? So, for example, if a friend of yours is saying to you, "Oh, you know about tourism, guess what? I'm going to go and do this." Like, how do you have these conversations without offending?
That is really challenging. I had a conversation with a friend very recently who had so many good memories of her time volunteering in Vietnam, and where I spent a lot of time doing some other tourism work myself. And I didn't want to take away from her experience because it had already taken place, and obviously had some really fond memories and is now hoping to donate some money to some charitable causes, which is not a bad thing, but maybe helping her understand that volunteering can take many different forms, and helping her realize that now that she's further in her career and has so many other skills and knowledge to offer, that might be a better use of her time to volunteer in a slightly different way that can really add value. So not minimizing the experience that's already taken place, but kind of signposting her to other opportunities that are out there, which are really making a bigger difference and not taking away from local jobs, I think, is the best way of doing this.
And I'm just going to start slightly now sort of move on in terms of the local element. You and I both were Gujarati. I say Guji, but not everybody knows what that is. But we are Guji. Now, I have to hands up here because my Guji, it's not so great. It's very much like child of immigrants, turn up, a bit embarrassed sometimes because nobody else was speaking Gujarati where I was. And also learning later on in life that actually some of the language skills that I have, they're not even Gujarati words, they're Swahili words because that's what my family, the languages that they've learned. You, however, I think are a little bit better than I am in terms of picking up the language and also making sure that it's maintained. You've really been able to immerse yourself with our language. But can you share a little bit more about that?
I think I've just always really enjoyed it and probably quite geeky of me, but I don't write. I think from a young age, my mum was a Gujarati teacher. So was my aunt, my mum's sister, for example. So Gujarati has always been a part of what we've enjoyed doing from a young age. My granddad would often pay me pocket money or extra pocket money if I read Gujarati books to him in the evening. So that kind of got me interested and invested in kind of practicing Gujarati at a young age. But I think it always came quite easy to me and I really enjoyed it. And more recently, I've enjoyed teaching young children Gujarati as well. During the lockdown, when we weren't able to continue our tours, I really enjoyed going back and teaching online and just creating new games. So games that we'd play in the playground, like What's the Time, Mr. Wolf, for example, and just translating them into Gujarati, teaching animals, teaching the time, teaching numbers. So yeah, now when these little children who are now like in their teens, for example, see me, they often shout out the word for wolf, which I'm sure you'll appreciate to know is actually varu. So we'd play a game with Ketla Vagyache Varu Bhai, and that would be just the most fun and it allowed me to be a child again for a few moments as well and just be more creative with learning languages. And I think that's really an important part of my growing up. And even now, I just really enjoy speaking to elders in our community as well, like hearing their stories. And I think having that language skill and having that confidence speaking Gujarati has really helped me get access to these stories sometimes and really helped me feel more connected to our history as a community also. And yeah, I just really love it so much.
I think it's fantastic. I'm like, it's interesting that you're saying this like with the Gujarati, because one of the challenges that I find, and this is on me, is that actually when you go to, there are apps, for example, there are spaces, but Gujarati isn't the language of choice. It isn't always factored in. So you'll have people using these apps and you're like, oh, maybe I can get back in. And actually it does take a lot more effort in order to be able to learn it. And for you to teach it, it also takes a lot of effort too. Why is it so important for you to make sure that this language is passed on to generations beyond you?
I think that's a really great question. I'm not sure how much success we will have really in making sure that we don't lose a lot of these language skills, for example, or that they'll remain as they are now. There'll be a lot of Ingrati or Gujalish, whatever you want to call it, a lot of mixture between Gujarati and English, and maybe adding in some Swahili and Hindi and other languages as well into the mix to make it a new language of its own. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, all language has been evolving throughout history and will continue to evolve. But I think we'll lose access to a lot of things when we lose the language completely. So whether it's understanding philosophy, for example, it's really hard to translate a lot of parts of Indian philosophy straight into English because the words for that just do not exist, or you have to rely on monotheistic terms for religions that weren't monotheistic themselves. It really means that you lose the essence of some of these philosophies and religions, which are really it's really quite a shame, I think. Even with things like culture, celebrating festivals and things, I think they're just such joyous moments and connections to our heritage. It'll be a shame to lose that, but it doesn't mean that they can't change in the way that they're taught and they can't be adapted. And I think that's where the challenge always was for our generation growing up in London. If it wasn't taught in a fun, accessible way, if it felt like a punishment almost to go to Gujarati school and learn the language, that was always going to turn people off from learning it more. But that doesn't need to be the case. In mainstream schools, we learn other languages like French and German and Spanish in really fun, innovative ways. So there's no reason why this can't be done for Gujarati as well. It's just that passion doesn't seem to be there. It just doesn't seem to be a priority for many people because they don't really see the value of learning Gujarati at a young age when most of the world speaks English. Whereas for me, like working in Indonesia, for example, a lot of their words come from Sanskrit. So having a good grasp of Gujarati really helped me learn the language so much faster as well. Or learning Burmese, for example, in the way that their alphabet, although it's written very differently, the structure of the alphabet and the way that the alphabet is written out and the sounds produced was made so much easier because I had a good grasp of Gujarati, which may be lost if you are looking to travel to remote places or work with different communities. And I think that's what is often missing when we think about Gujarati, having been born and raised in the UK.
I mean, you said about other languages, but actually the UK isn't known for being a country that embraces other languages, and there had been cuts and stuff. And so I certainly have envy over my parents where they'll speak multiple languages, and they'll do it so quickly and be able to pick things up so quickly, much in the same way that you're saying that you're able to. So it's wonderful that you're doing this and bringing it forth. How do you maintain buoyancy in spaces where you've been, which aren't always the most easiest, most fun, most joyous spaces to navigate?
That is a very interesting question. I don't think I have always maintained buoyancy, is the honest truth to that. I think hearing a lot of stories, like people sharing really personal, traumatic stories about surviving human trafficking, for example, it's really difficult to maintain that level of buoyancy, but also you want to acknowledge and respect their story and really help support them sharing that story as well. So I think there needs to be a fine balance between, I guess I'm still trying to work out the best way to work in this space and to support the individuals who share their stories and trust me with their stories. I mean, that's a big responsibility to be able to hold that safe space for them to share those stories, but also not let it affect my own mental well-being, which is not always a very easy thing. And I'm sure you appreciate that with the work that you've done in so many different spaces also. It's definitely still a learning curve for me. I have recently started taking better care of my mental well-being with therapy sessions, for example, which has been really important because secondhand trauma is very real. And I really was finding it quite challenging with a lot of the stories I've been listening to. That doesn't stop me wanting to do this work, but I think I'm realizing more the importance of self-preservation also, or just taking care of yourself so that you have the ability to continue the work that you want to do. And that's taken me a long time to realize that.
And that was the amazing Jayni Gudka. Do you have an interdisciplinary life? Because I would love to hear from you, and maybe we can chat on this podcast that goes with my newsletter, which is called Have You Thought About, and can be found via www.drutisha.com. Please join me next time for a great conversation with another guest who likes to mix up lots of things in their life. Do listen to past episodes and rate and review the podcast if you've enjoyed it. Thank you to Rian Shah for the music.